Well, thank you very, very much. I'm honored to be here. And thank you, Diane, and thank you, Melanie, for making it all possible. It's such a trip to be in a museum that honors a writer. It's really unusual, especially a woman writer. And so I'm very, very happy to be here. How to introduce this book, how to talk about this book. I was in Saratoga Springs this summer and at an arts festival, and I was giving a little talk much like this, and at the end a woman raised her hand and she said, "Thank you so much for writing a book about complex daughters of complex fathers." And I started saying something about, oh yes, I mean men who are in powerful positions are. She said, "No, my father was a farmer." And I realized that that's what I had done. I had written a book about, I'm a complex daughter of a complex father. And my idea, how to put it, another person said, well, this book is a love story. And I said, oh, that makes sense. You start off really beautifully. Everything is wonderful between you, and then you start to fight, and you start to butt heads, and then it ends up all right at the end. That's the arc of a love story. And for many years, I didn't think that my story with my father was a love story. I thought it was a very sad story of something gone terribly wrong. At first I thought it had gone terribly wrong for kind of ordinary, though painful, reasons. My mother, I'm the oldest of 9 children. My mother, who was an extremely dynamic woman, and my father were wonderful partners together in an inner city ministry in Lower Jersey City after World War II. I grew up in a home that was very integrated into the church, the Episcopal Church, but my parents were kind of pioneers in a kind of progressive vision, an activist vision for the Episcopal Church in the early 50s. And it was as if I was part with them of the world and the intellectual and social context that gave birth to the civil rights movement and all the great movements of the 60s and 70s. And then when she was 50, when she was 48, my mother was in a near-fatal automobile accident, and when she was 50, she died, leaving my youngest sister was 11 and I was 27. And not only that, she and my father their marriage had begun to come apart. And I didn't know why particularly that had happened, but her death and the kind of beginning dissolution of their marriage sort of broke apart really quite a magical world. And that's kind of the ordinary part. I mean, the extraordinary part is what the world was. The world was involved in idealism about Christian love. It was involved in idealism about let's have a great big family. We had prayers every evening after dinner. We always sang either "Now the Day is Over" or "Abide with Me." It was very kind of magical, and both my parents were very active and brought us into social activism of that time. And then what happened was that my father 18 months after my mother died, he married a woman 2 years older than me who was really not interested in his 9 children. She was very interested in him, but she wasn't interested in his children, and that was really very difficult. And I, by that time, was out in my own life, but things just started to fall apart between my father and me. And truly, he began to have a different relationship with the family. And so for many years, it was a kind of difficult, painful time, but a kind of conventionally difficult, painful time. A lot of people have difficult stepmothers. A lot of people, have terribly, complicated relationships with parents. But what happened was that in 1990, it was revealed, it came out in our family that my father had all his life, a hidden life as a bisexual man. And my reaction to this was, oh, that explains it. That explains, the kind of lack of access. And the other thing that was going on for me was that this was a period of time in my life when I was involved with women. And so I felt as if I had a kind of special privilege in terms of this new news about my father, and that perhaps finally we would really talk about things. Finally, I might get to know my father. And really a theme of this book is the daughter of me, the complex daughter, keeps saying, maybe now I'll get to know this complicated father of mine. But that didn't happen. My father, understandably, did not really want to discuss this part of his private life with me. He had never intended that this become public in any way. And it's then that the kind of that the story of my relationship with him and becomes less ordinary, although many people are in that situation. It was less ordinary. I didn't know anybody else in that situation at the time. And I didn't know it at the time, but I really missed my father. I really missed my childhood and youthful, intimate, sort of political conversations and conversations about love and conversations about, belief and God, and are all religions different, or are all religions really the same? Just those wonderful, powerful conversations I used to have with him. I kind of forgot about them. I forgot that they had ever happened. And like many people in this day and age, I was also in therapy through some of this time, and I remember my therapist saying to me after I had in the mid-90s, I returned to men and had a disastrous first relationship with a man, and I was weeping, and my therapist said, well, this must be connected to your father, and you must have once loved your father very much. And I said, I did not. I had really, really forgotten. There was also an anecdote, two. One is that my father was, in addition to all of his other heroic things that he was a war hero. He was shot through the chest in Guadalcanal, and he got 3 medal. So he was a decorated war hero, and he used to say, if my heart had been going this way instead of that way, you would never have existed. And so this was powerful father, 6'5", extremely handsome, brocade vestments in the church. As a friend of mine said to me, a lot of magic. But I remember once his saying in his sort of mid-70s, the doctor says, I'm so healthy that I'll live to be 150 and they'll have to shoot me. So there really was this myth of this, and I just got a letter from someone who'd read the book, and she said, I want to know, we were traveling in Norway in 2000 and whatever, and there was this 80-year-old former Episcopal bishop from New York with his 2 grandchildren, and he ran up those mountains. And, he was very energetic. So it was actually a shock when he got melanoma and was diagnosed with terminal melanoma just around New Year's of 2003. And I was then living in New York where he was living, and I had been, over the years, writing chunks about my father. It was a way that I, since I'm a writer, it's a way that I dealt with this painful relationship. And I'd write things about when I was a child, or I'd write various scenes, and when his secret came out, and I wrote the scene about how we couldn't talk about it, and I had all these manuscript pages, and once in a while, twice I decided to write a book. Once I got 80 pages into a memoir, couldn't do it. Then another time I got 80 pages into a novel, couldn't do it. I mean, about the same material. And then I realized, I can't do this. So here's my father terminally ill, and suddenly I become this very willing participant in all the things one does with a terminally ill parent. I mean, I had several sisters in New York to share it with, but nonetheless I was going to those hospital appointments and so on and so forth. And as his illness progressed, I found this love and this remembering coming back. It was truly involuntary. I mean, in fact, I would say to myself, ew, am I going to have to, love him? I mean, it was very strange experience. And at the time, I was also scared I would never write again. So I asked an editor. I had a friend who was not a friend, but I called this editor of the American Scholar, and it turned out they had a feature called Journal. And I said, I'll keep a journal of my father dying. I thought he would never die. I thought that terrible thing we all go through, how much of your very busy and important life, do you give to this dying parent, and how much do you keep for yourself, and how can you make those? It's very hard. I mean, it turns out that, of course, you should spend as much time as possible with the dying parent, but then you started to feel that I was drowning, and so on and so forth. So I thought, well, I keep this journal, and then at least I've written something. So this progressed, and what happened was we reconciled. I mean, all the anger dissolved, and in the end, through a remarkable accident and chance, I was actually alone with him when he died. And it was a kind of amazing experience of really feeling the gift of having, at the very last minute, albeit my father back. And then I began, and one of the things that happened in that process of him dying was that I started to, how to put this, kind of, he became very physical to me. I started to sort of notice his huge, long body and his kind of funny smile, and it was just a kind of transfiguring experience. And when he had died, I happened to have already been signed up to go to a artist retreat called Yaddo, and I started to write this. I finished the journal thing, and then I realized I was going to write a book. I just realized I was going to write a book. And part of what I wanted to do was to integrate, the main thing I wanted to do was to tell the story of this complex daughter and complex father, this relationship, and this happening over this the second half of the American century, from World War II, basically, to the Iraq War. He died about 6 weeks after the war in Iraq was started. And also, I wanted to integrate the information about his sexuality. He'd written a memoir in which he had not included his sexuality, in which I'd tried to get him to do, and other people had too, and he just couldn't. And I concluded that it was, he said, I can't hurt your stepmother again, and I just couldn't face my brother and sister, and he had a lot of reasons, but I think in the end it was just, he said, I wish I could, but I couldn't. And I had an intuition that part of his greatness, which my writing the book and my research on the book increased my admiration for him, had to do with his own suffering. That is, he was one of many people who are hurt, are not able to transform that into a life of helping others, but he was. And I wanted to put all that in context. I also wanted to think about my own sexual journey in relation to his. And I also wanted to place both of us in the history that we lived within and through. So that was part of what I was involved in. The other thing that became clear to me is that my father told stories. He was a great storyteller, and one of his methods of preaching was to tell a story. And he told us stories when we were little. He made up stories. I remember when I was very little, he said, okay, you each can make up a character and I'll tell stories. So he said to me, who was my character? And I said, well, a fairy princess named Josephine with beautiful blonde hair. And said to my brother, what's your character? Well, an eagle named Daniel. And to my little sister, then there were only three of us, what about you? Well, I want a rabbit named Peter. So there were all these stories about the eagle and Josephine flying and the rabbit and, these adventures. Or if he'd go to preach to children, he'd go to a parish to preach when he was a bishop. And, bishops carry a crozier, which is a kind of stylized shepherd's crook. Well, he actually carried a shepherd's crook. He actually had a wooden shepherd's crook. That was his kind of signature. And he'd go to the parishes and he would, first he'd do a little sermon for the kids, and he'd actually make the kids come out in the aisle and be the sheep, and he'd be the shepherd, and it'd be Jesus the shepherd, and he'd get the, the crook, and he'd get, and he was very dramatic that way. And then he'd get up in the pulpit and he'd be very dramatic there for the grown-ups. And there actually was a time in my life when I decided when I just despaired of having a relationship with him. Well, I'll just come and hear him preach because he's such a great preacher, and all this love comes from him when he preaches. I'm a poet. He's a preacher. I'm most myself in my poems and writing. He's most himself preaching. So maybe that's what it's supposed to be. I'm grown up. I don't. It's not like I need a father for the reasons you need fathers for when you're a little girl. So, anyway, that was before what I came to call the revelations of his hidden life. The other thing I want to so that's the kind of emotional framework. It turned out when I started working, people ask, well, what kind of material did you have? I'd written a book about my grandmother, who was a painter named Margaret Sargent, and I'd had very little stuff. Here I had 2,000 pages of letters between my parents during the war, including their courtship and the first year and her pregnancy with me. I didn't know these existed. They turned up after he died. His oral history at Columbia University, three books of his, a memoir by my mother, many of my letters from each of my parents, which I happen to have saved. We wrote letters a lot. They had saved my letters to them. I had my diaries from 1970 and some childhood diaries, and I have a very alive memory. So I had a lot of stuff, and then I put together with the help of an assistant, a journalistic record, because he was in the newspaper a lot. He was first dean of the cathedral in the Episcopal Cathedral in Indianapolis, where I knew my friend John Allardyce, who I haven't seen for 40 years until tonight. He was suffragan bishop in Washington, D.C. during the Johnson years, and then he was the Bishop of New York in the 70s and 80s, and all the time there's a real record of his activism in the journalistic record. I don't know, maybe I've forgotten some of it. Oh, and my mother kept meticulous and abundant scrapbooks from the time of their courtship up until her death in 1973. So there was just so much stuff and so many feelings. And in the case of my mother, I had written quite a bit about her before, so in that case I didn't want to write the same thing again, so there was most of my writing about my mother had been in my 20s and 30s, so how's it different when I'm in my late 50s and 60s? So I set about, and I had all these things I told you, that my rantings and ravings that I'd written. So it was to kind of distill from all this material a story, our story, in the context of, as I said, the kind of social and emotional history of the time. People are always saying, well, was it therapeutic? And someone was saying last night at a panel discussion I did, the therapeutic part is for the reader, the cathartic part. For me, it was a kind of clarifying experience. And my parents really went from being these vibrating, talismanic, larger-than-life figures who were all infused with my imagination, and now they're people, and I miss them. You know, they were too intense to miss before the experience of writing this book. But now I just think once in a while, I think, oh, what would she have thought about that? What would he have thought about that? I thought I know that this is meant to be mainly a talk, and I'm not going to read much, but I did want to read just this little part about Jersey City, and it'll give you, I think, a sense of what life was like for me as a child and how this whole story started. And then there'll be some time for questions and answers. My father went to General Seminary in New York, which is an Episcopal divinity school, and my mother, an early feminist agitator there, because, you know, women weren't allowed to come to the special lectures, and she put an end to that, organized the other women and put an end to that. They made a decision to, with two other priests, the four of them as a team, to work in the inner city. They wrote to several Episcopal bishops, where can we go? We don't need to be paid very much. My father came from a very privileged background, and he didn't ever take any salary in Jersey City. We want to work. And so they ended up in Jersey City, New Jersey. And so I'm just going to read a couple of pages. How many pages? It'll take about, 8 minutes. My father, who had imagined himself as the headmaster at St. Paul's School, where he'd gone in New Hampshire, or alone in a room writing books, found himself with two friends, an intrepid wife with whom he had conceived a life of partnership, and two tiny children, at the threshold of what would be the formative adventure of his career. Like the Marines, which had made him a man, but a man he could not have imagined himself becoming, Jersey City would define him as a priest. Though I hardly remember the crowded church and the crush of priests and bishops, I saw my father ordained to the priesthood the following winter in Jersey City. On December 17th, 1949, he celebrated his first Eucharist that Christmas. In the years we lived in Jersey City, having been born into my grandparents' world of monogrammed linens, tea every day at 4, country houses, full-time servants, and chauffeured cars, I became a public school pupil among girls whose Polish and Irish fathers worked the waterfront and factories of Jersey City, or whose African-American parents, born in the South, had come north in the Great Migration. Family and friends asked us with varying degrees of tact how long we would stay in such an area with a family, my mother wrote. We told them we didn't know. Dorothy Day, the great Catholic activist who was a friend, offered immediate instruction. When my mother, overwhelmed with the children, the house, the church, asked her what to do about the contradiction between Christian service and an orderly household, Dorothy Day replied sharply, "Lower your standards." When I remember the Catholic Worker, of which Dorothy Day was the editor, printed on newsprint and illustrated with dense woodcuts by the Quaker artist Fritz Eichenberg, of Christ huddled in the bread line at a soup kitchen, of Christ as a worker or a farmer, I think of my mother employing her considerable wit and imagination to base a household on Dorothy Day's ideas and doing all the work with very little help. In the narrow brownstone rectory, we lived on the second floor, and Kim Myers and Bob Pegram, the other two priests, on the third. The first floor was common, and in the manner of a Catholic worker house of hospitality, the doors were thrown open. We had what we came to call an open rectory. Poor men with nowhere else to go and breath thick with whiskey drank my mother's homemade soup on the front porch. Families burned out of their apartments outfitted themselves in the clothes room in the basement, leaving a child or two to stay with us until the church helped them find a new apartment. All of this was made possible, even necessary, by the pursuit of an ideal that flowed from a belief shared by the team of Grace Church of what being a Christian meant in a modern city, and it included political and social action in behalf of parishioners evicted, jailed, or excluded from illegally segregated federal housing projects. The supper table was crowded not only with random hungry kids or men from the porch set, the men on the porch, but priests maybe from India or Africa, activists from England or France, the curious among my parents' East Side friends or college volunteers. The conversation to which I avidly listened, asking questions like, what is communism, was a weave of politics, religion, wisecracks, and laughter. And the meal, cooked by my mother, was introduced by my father, or Father Myers or Father Pegram saying grace, all of us holding hands, thanking God for what we were about to eat. There was always enough, as Dorothy Day said of such tables. Everyone just takes a little less. Soon I was old enough to stay up with the grown-ups on Christmas Eve. After supper, oyster stew, which my mother made with great pride, Father Myers and Father Pegram and my father would leave to vest for the service. Let's say it's the first Christmas Eve I am allowed to go to midnight mass. My grandmother has come for the night and friends from New York, and we all wait until about 9 to go over to the church. The purple that has shrouded everything for the 4 weeks of Advent has been replaced by glistening white. White flowers from the greenhouse at Hollow Hill, the farm where my father grew up, arranged by the altar guild with holly, adorn the steps up to the altar, and the almost life-size creche to the left of the nave is no longer empty. Carved from wood and beautifully painted, Mary and Joseph are there, and the baby, and the shepherds and the animals. The 3 kings won't arrive until Epiphany on January 6th. The real hay is from my grandmother's farm. Everyone is wearing their best clothes, and the church is full, the smells of perfume and aftershave mingling with the fragrance of the evergreen that thickens the roof of the creche. And as we walk to our pew, there are whispered exchanges of, Merry Christmas, God bless you. The Williamses and the Skippers and the Walkers who are black, the new Puerto Rican families, and the white old ladies who still come to the church even though there have been so many changes. And I see some of the people who worked here in the summer and the nuns who have come to teach Sunday school. On this particular Christmas Eve, I watch my father climb the pulpit. Merry Christmas, he says, which is strange since it's something he would also say outside church. And this raises laughs of quiet delight in the congregation and soft intakes of breath. My father smiles in response, and then as he begins to speak as a priest, his tone changes and he is preaching. Tonight the sermon is just like a story. Mary is pregnant and lives with Joseph, the father of her child, right near here. But because he has lost his job, they are without a home. And because they are black, the motel has turned them away. They are cold and afraid, and her time is near as they walk the dark, empty streets until they see an old garage, its door ajar. There, Joseph finds an old lantern and a kerosene heater in the corner, and a few old pasteboard boxes and some rags blackened with motor oil that must have been used to repair a car. Stretching out his long arms, my father tenderly describes Joseph settling Mary onto a pile of those rags. And he looks down at us, and then, lifting his face, he says, emphasizing certain words, and as a bright star appeared in the sky, the baby was born. Jesus was born. And he continues, the Christ child was laid in a box of those rags by the light of the strange old railroad lantern. I could see Mary and Joseph. I could see the shadowy, cold garage, the battered lantern, the kerosene heater. My father was both someone else entirely and just as I knew him, and the story seemed completely true, happening right here in the neighborhood where we lived in the tall, narrow rectory. I understood miracles. My mother read me the lives of saints, of martyrs, and my father had told the story of St. Christopher, who carried a child across the river. his weight growing heavier and heavier until Christopher could barely walk, terrified he might stumble and drown the child. But he did not stumble or allow the child on his shoulders to fall into the turbulent, stormy current. And when he reached the opposite shore, the child leapt from his shoulders, and standing there in the darkness was suddenly illuminated, revealed as the Christ child. This Christmas night, it seemed that my father, by telling the nativity story in a new way, had himself created a kind of miracle. He had made me see and smell and feel. When I told him how much I liked his sermon, he looked down at me and smiled. I don't remember when I did not carry a sense of the miraculous. I expected such marvels, and I looked for them. In our dining room one day on the wall, there appeared a piece of paper that looked like the mottled black and white cover of a notebook. My mother said that if I stood and looked at it, Jesus would appear. The dining room was toward the back of the house, closed off from the living room by a pair of sliding doors, and tacked to those doors with the black and white piece of paper. And I stood there and looked at it, certain the Christ child, or the man he became, would appear to me, as he had in my father's sermon, as he had to Mary Magdalene at the empty grave on Easter morning. I was alone there, and I stood waiting, but no matter how long I looked and waited, I couldn't see him. My mother rushed in and out of the room doing housework, and I stood there. I couldn't see Jesus. I couldn't see Jesus' face, but I kept standing there looking, because my mother had said, "There he is." And I'll just read the very, very end of the book. This is the very end of my father's funeral at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Now, as his coffin passed me, I stepped out into the aisle and joined the crush of family. There are nearly 40 of us now. The organist was playing Bach, a saxophone spinning a descant into the dark reaches of the arched Gothic ceiling, faces from my whole life whirling in my peripheral vision. And then I look up, and the cathedral doors, the doors that open only at Easter for the bishop's entrance, are now wide open, throwing a shaft of light onto the pale surface of the pine coffin, the waxy shine reflecting daylight radiance. And as we move out through the doors, the coffin leading us, I see that the stairs of the cathedral, scores of stairs that spill downward from the arched entrance, are crowded with bishops and priests and nuns and monks in their vestments and habits, their red and their white, their African or Asian vestments, their Trappist and Franciscan habits and rope sashes, their tippets, kata, surplices, and cassocks, and they are clapping as my father's coffin is borne slowly down the stairs, clapping, not applauding, and not exactly rhythmically clapping either, solemnity on their faces, as if a medieval guild were bidding farewell to one of its own, their hands coming together, the sound both very loud and barely audible, as I stand there, eyes burning, and the coffin, the light of the white sky blazing from it, slides into the open trunk of a black hearse. And then I understand that this is the end of my father, that inside the coffin is his body, and that when I see him again, he will be ashes. And so, as the clapping continues, I fly down the final steps, the attendants moving away from the open doors of the hearse, and I touch the wood. Alone there, I touch the coffin, at the same time seeing myself in black, a woman bending toward a coffin, her hand reaching. Thank you. I would be happy to answer any questions at all. Yes?
How did the writing of the book affect your relationship with your siblings?
Well, my father always used to say, you know, when he was in the midst of controversy, he would say, well, there's a spectrum of response. And because I have 8 brothers and sisters, I can say that about my siblings. From powerful support to total incomprehension and many things in between. I was very scrupulous to tell my story, and the book is actually dedicated to my siblings each of whom would have another story, is what the dedication says. Yeah.
Your family was big enough to have its own political party.
Right.
I don't really have a question. I have a comment. I read every word of it. It's beautifully written, and it's a fascinating tale. I have a sense about this book that it's going to have a very long life.
Well.
Because of the issue it addresses. And I think the timing of the book is wonderful because this is a time when the Episcopal Church has stepped out into a leadership position in this extremely important social issue of acceptance of the people. And I think, and your book shines such a powerful light on this issue. It's not anything you made up, it's real. Over decades of experience. I think that's extremely important to have in this book. I'm very proud of our church for stepping into it. And in my own family, I've had this issue.
Right.
So to me, this is a very, very important. I'm so glad.
Well, thank you. It's of course I did think about that, but I am a writer and I am a poet, and it's this was just too big to fit in a poem, is all I can say. So I'm always eager to a little bit talk about, or at least mention, that when an artist is compelled to make something, it really does become a matter of life and death, and you really have no alternative. I mean, I had no alternative, and there is an anecdote in the book which perhaps you'll remember. I go to London. Maybe those of you who are familiar with the Episcopal Church controversy remember that in the fall of 2003, the Archbishop of Canterbury called a special meeting of the primates. That's actually what they're called, all the archbishops of the church around the world. And I, out of character, because in spite of the fact that I can stand here and talk to you, I really, being a journalist I'm way too shy for that, but I did force myself to go and cover that for The Nation magazine, and I met there a priest of my age, an Anglican priest of my age, who's a gay man, and I said, well, I was taking my notes, and I said, well, what is the issue of inclusion for you? And he said, for me, it's that the more we get to know each other as human beings in all our complexity and diversity, the more we see the true nature of God in all its complexity. And that was a kind of way of saying that idea that I had never heard before. And that was very powerful for me. And so it made me really want to be as complicated in the story as life is complicated. Yeah.
Is your first name really Honor?
Yeah.
That's really a heavy burden for a child. And how do you think that influenced her? Did your parents ever tell you why they named you that?
Yeah, you can read about it in The Bishop's Daughter. What they would say is I liked the name, but this is an interesting story. I found that I couldn't write this book at home, so I was absolutely shameless in the number of writing colonies and artist colonies I applied to and got into and wrote this book at. And one of them was a place called Bellagio, which is the Rockefeller Foundation Work and Study Center on Lake Como. And it's not just artists, it's also scholars and philosophers and mathematicians and evolutionary biologists. And as it happened, there was a fellow there, a literary critic, a professor at Yale, who was writing a book on honor, on the word honor, the notion of honor. It started out as the notion of honor in Shakespeare, and it expanded. And it was sort of, this does happen when you're making something. Those of you who write know this. Every place you go, everything has to do with. But this was really, and I thought, I guess I better talk about my name. you know. And so I did give it some thought, and I think that it was very much a name that was out of the kind of post-war optimism. You know, he had been wounded. He'd killed at least one Japanese soldier. He almost died. My mother, you know, unlike, you know, this war in which not everybody knows about it, everybody was in it, in that war. And I think the kind of great happiness of the war being over and the idea that this will never happen. I think I was sort of named in the spirit that the United Nations was founded, and, you know, all the things happened that happened after the war. So I do think it had a meaning in spite of the fact that, say, oh, we just liked the name and each of us had a friend called Honor and so on.
Who was the poet who wrote the line, "I could not love you"?
Richard Lovelace, yeah, the English Cavalier poet. 20 telegrams at my birth. I think it's the 17th century. It's a poem called "To Lucasta Going to the War," and the line is, he's leaving his beloved, and he says, "I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more," you know, honor in battle more. Surely someone else has a question. Yes.
I'm looking forward to reading it, and I appreciate your telling the story very much. I read the piece in the New Yorker.
Uh-huh.
It came out before the book.
It came out on February 25th, and the book came out on May 20th.
Was the fact of this double life very well known?
It was an open secret. In other words, I had journalists call me after his death, referring to it, and people knew. I think particularly in the Episcopal Church and particularly around New York. But it was just one of those, you know, Rock Hudson. Yeah.
I knew your father in New York, and I worship at St. John's in the Village.
Oh,
And after he retired,
he came there.
he came there, and he installed my rector. And so we had a particular relationship with him, and we loved him very much. And in preparation for reading your book, I read your book about your grandmother.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to have the context of your family life. Before I read about this man, for whom I felt a great sympathy, because when he would come one or two times a month to worship at our community, I felt his loneliness, and I felt his sadness as a human being, and he was just always kind to us, and we called him Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read the book, I felt I knew so many of those priests. And Kim Myers was then the Bishop of California, for whom our rector had been the chaplain.
Oh.
And I knew Leslie Laughlin, knew all of those people in the book, and so it was redolent of my history in the Episcopal Church. I'm a general seminary graduate.
Uh-huh.
And I feel so grateful for your having written the book, because the life of this man for whom so many of us looked up to know that his life was infinitely more complex and more tortured, really. And I really have a profound understanding for living a double life and for what it must be like to be a priest who has this double life going on and trying to live a life of honor while being tortured by this double identity that he had that he couldn't share.
Right.
Made me love him even more. And I appreciate your bringing this issue to the world and telling other people that life is much more complicated than many people would like to know or would like to believe, and how people prevail
So beautifully said. Thank you. The last time I saw my father, actually in a kind of liturgical role, was when he baptized my youngest nephew at St. John's. Any other questions? Thank you so very much for coming and having me.